Be honest, do you know what the maximum voices setting does in BeamNG?
Yes.
Your answer is probably no, and there's a good chance that applies to a bunch of other settings you don't even know exist. Well, I hate to say it, but you've been missing out big time, because the settings I'm about to show you are literally game-changing. Now before we actually start changing the settings, I need your full and undivided attention. This video is not about optimizing BeamNG's graphics settings. It's about optimizing everything else, which in my opinion will have a much greater impact on your overall experience. And so feel free to follow along, whether you're an absolute beginner or an allergic to grass veteran, as I explain what each setting does and help you decide what you should or shouldn't change. Just to be clear, I've clocked in almost 1500 hours on BeamNG, and I uninstall and reinstall the game about twice a month. Not because I'm crazy, even though I am, but because I always seem to break something while making my stupid videos. So now that you know what this video is, and that I kinda maybe hopefully know what I'm talking about, let's begin by opening up the settings. And to do that, you simply press escape and click on options. By the way, do not do this from the main menu, as some settings can't be accessed from there, so make sure you're actually spawned in-game. With that said, let's begin with the display settings, which are split into two main sections: general and virtual reality. I still have deep trauma from my VR video, so I'll cover those another time. The first thing you want to change is display mode. When you install the game for the first time, it will be set to windowed. There are mentally insane people out there who enjoy playing in windowed mode, but personally, I paid for the whole monitor and I'll use the whole monitor. So for that, there's two options: full screen and borderless. I'd recommend going with borderless because full screen goes back into windowed mode every time the game loses focus, like when you accidentally press the Windows button, open Chrome, and buy some sweet merch from shopmew.com. But with borderless, the game fills up your entire screen at all times, which is great for quickly hopping onto Discord, searching for new mods, or, I don't know, buying some merch. And before we move on, just remember that to apply the display settings, you need to press apply the display settings. As for the monitor setting, feel free to ignore it if you only have a single screen. But if like me you have two or more, you can choose which one the game is displayed on. As for the resolution and refresh rate settings, I think it's safe to say that they're pretty self-explanatory, but bear in mind that they won't be editable unless you're in full screen. If you have the power to run the game natively, then stick to borderless. But if you still need more frames, you can consider switching to full screen and dropping the resolution. Next up, there's the gamma slider, which I recommend leaving as is. Now you may be asking yourself, why? And same thing with the experimental multi-monitor renderer. Leave it unchecked unless you have a triple monitor setup and wrongfully think it is superior to VR. Now these next ones are really important. Please, for the love of pigeons, enable vertical sync. In short, this setting will synchronize the game's frame rate to your monitor's refresh rate. And this is such a no-brainer, as it will eliminate stuttering and screen tearing, making your game feel smoother, as well as ensuring your computer only renders the frames that can be displayed, potentially making it run cooler and quieter. So if for example your monitor has a 60Hz refresh rate, the game will be limited to 60 FPS. Keep in mind, if your computer simply isn't powerful enough to run the game at or above your monitor's refresh rate, you will get stuttering and tearing whether you've enabled vertical sync or not. This is where the next setting comes in: the frame rate limiter. If you can run the game above 30 FPS, but struggle to maintain a stable 60 FPS, then limiting it to 30 may provide a smoother and tear-free experience. The second use case, which is the one I use, is for creating content. My monitor has a 144Hz refresh rate, but since I record and edit my videos in 60 frames per second, I also limit my frame rate to 60 FPS. And as soon as I'm done recording and I want to go back at playing at high refresh rates, I simply uncheck this box. And by the way, if you want to check your frame rate to determine what settings to use, the keyboard shortcut is Ctrl F. Finally, the last setting is limit frame rate to 30 when window is not in focus, which I would strongly recommend enabling, as it will limit your game to 30 FPS when you have it running in the background. For example, sometimes I'll quickly hop on YouTube or Discord while playing, and there would simply be no reason to have the game rendering at 144 frames per second when I won't see a single one of them. And that is all for the display section. Which means we can now move on to graphics. But Moye, you said shut up. We won't be going over the graphics settings, but there is one option I want to talk about, and that's bump detail below 30 degrees of view. I've seen a lot of confusion around this setting, and rightfully so, because there is no official documentation on it. But basically, what this setting does is bumping the level of detail if the field of view is 30 degrees or lower. Like for example, when you zoom in photo mode. What this setting doesn't do is increase the detail in the center of the screen. it will only make a difference while zooming in. Now if you enjoy taking photos, enable this setting. But if you find yourself using the cinematic camera, you may want to disable it, as it can cause annoying LED refreshes while the camera zooms in and out. And with that covered, let's move on to the user interface, where we'll start from the bottom with the UI maximum resolution setting. This controls the scale of the user interface from the menus to the UI apps. For the sake of this video, I'm using 1920 by 1080, so you can actually see what I'm doing. But usually I have it set to disabled, as it displays more information on the screen, which means I don't have to scroll as much through BeamNG's laggy AR menus. Next up, you can choose whether to show or hide the challenge markers. I honestly don't like having them visible, as they kinda break immersion, so I uncheck this option. Unfortunately, there is no way to start a challenge from map view, which is something that should definitely be added. So if you have mission markers disabled, but still want to play the missions, you'll have to re-enable them every time. Moving on, we have two rich presence settings. If you enable these, your Steam and Discord friends will be able to see what you're doing in-game. I usually have both of these disabled, but it really depends on whether you care or not about others seeing what you're doing instead of touching grass. As for the number of parallel repository downloads, I think that's self-explanatory, but please be careful with automatic mod updates. I recommend only enabling this option if you subscribe to less than 20 mods from the repository, because otherwise you'll be constantly bombarded with mod updates every time you open the game. To be clear, this will only affect mods you subscribe to from the repository, which is this thing. If you download some shitty mesh lab from Modland, it won't receive any automatic updates. And finally, there's the unit system. If you're American, you'll be more than happy to stick to the Freedom Eagle Hamburger Imperial option, but if you're more of a metric system enjoyer, it's not that simple. You see, the metric preset displays engine power in kilowatts and pressure in bar. Now I don't know about you, but I have no fun. What I like to do is use the custom setting, and then set pressure to PSI, power to horsepower, and fuel consumption to miles per gallon. And so that is it for user interface. Now we're gonna skip language because there's really only one option, which takes us onto the audio tab. Now this may come as a surprise, but the maximum voice setting doesn't control the ones in your head. Instead, I'm pretty sure it limits the amount of audio files that can be played at any given time. I say pretty sure because again, there is no official documentation on this. Personally, I have it set to Ultra just because I can, even though deep down, I know I would not be able to tell the difference between it and normal. So this really is up to you, but I'd recommend leaving it to normal. As for the stereo headphone settings, I honestly have no idea what it does. So I guess if you have stereo headphones, or even stereo speakers for that matter, go ahead and turn it on. This next one is pretty self-explanatory. It will mute the game when you click off of it. So for example, you hop on a random website and don't want to hear the continuous drone of your idling engine in the background, then leave this option ticked. Personally, I prefer turning it off and pausing the game before doing something else, but it really comes down to personal preference. And finally, we have the volume sliders. These settings allow you to individually adjust the volumes of these different categories. I personally bring the master volume and the user interface down to 50 and crank the collision and the aero up to 100. And that is it for audio, which doesn't take us to controls. Seriously, this section is all yours to discover, as it is personal preference to the highest degree, but if you really want to know what controls I use, I guess you can beg me in the comments and maybe I'll make a video on it. Which now actually takes us to the juiciest section of them all, gameplay. The gameplay settings are split into 6 different subsections, so let's go over them one by one, starting with general, which I personally leave untouched. If you want to cheat in scenarios, disable the competitive scenario conditions and become your bloodline's greatest disappointment. If you want to play with friends locally, you can enable multi-seat and have the time of your life. Just kidding, there is no split screen. As for this mile recovery system, I recommend leaving it on, even though it can sometimes be annoying when it decides to reset your vehicle in suboptimal locations. And finally, there is no good reason to disable gas stations in free roam, unless you have beef with its super cute UI. As for the driving aids and assistants, I like a pure driving experience, which is why I turn most of them off. But if you suck, you may want to keep them on to avoid crashing every 5 seconds. ABS mode determines how your ABS, which stands for anti-lock braking system, behaves, and you can choose between realistic, off, and arcade. BeamNG has world-class ABS simulation, so I would strongly recommend leaving it as is. Arcade is the easiest in terms of driving, though not as realistic, and off takes you back to 1977. As for the default gearbox behavior, arcade will automatically shift gears for you on any car, even those with a manual transmission, whereas realistic won't. I love banging through gears and destroying transmissions, so I set it to realistic, and disable the gearbox safety assistant, which allows me to do all sorts of funny things like shifting from 5th to 3rd. If you decide to go for the realistic gearbox behavior, make sure you know what buttons you need for shifting. By default, X shifts up and Z shifts down, with shift being your clutch. But please, for the love of pigeons, don't use a keyboard. I actually mainly use a controller, which is why I always leave the clutch assistant on, apart from when I'm using my wheel. As for the throttle assistant, I find it kind of annoying as it prevents me from destroying my synchros and power shifting like that fat Honda guy. So if you want to have more freedom with your shifting technique, turn it off. Now the oversteer and understeer reduction assistants are really good if you're just getting started with driving simulators or playing on a keyboard, but personally, I like my inputs to be raw, just like my chicken, so I turn them off, together with slower steering at high speed. If you're on keyboard, you could also consider enabling limit steering at high speed, and definitely keep this last one on. As for the vehicle behavior section, just leave them on, and it's the same story with the traffic section. Although the only thing I would change is the max amount of vehicles, because the auto option does tend to overestimate your computer's performance. And finally, right at the bottom, there's the simplified collision physics, which disables vehicle-to-vehicle collisions as well as vehicle self-collisions. Please don't. That is it for the gameplay section, which leads us onto quite another juicy one: the camera. Here we have 7 subsections, but since it's pretty straightforward, we'll only be going over a few. Starting with general, I set the camera switch transition time to 0 milliseconds because I can't stand this animation, and the vehicle switch transition time to a snappier 300 milliseconds. And finally, please leave collision on as it stops the camera from going through walls and stuff. The switching order lets you set what cameras you can cycle through and in what order. I recommend leaving it as is, and you can still switch to the other cameras by using your keyboard. The orbit camera settings are perfect out of the box, so I'd recommend completely ignoring these settings, and same thing for the chase camera, but for the opposite reason. It's an absolute steaming pile of shit. But as for the driver camera, there is one setting that desperately needs changing: the field of view. In my opinion, 45 degrees is just too narrow, which is why I bump it up to 60 degrees. As usual, this is personal preference, but come on, at 45 degrees you can't even see your gauge cluster. As for the other settings, these control the way the camera moves around as you drive, which I find to be really good out of the box. The only thing I would change is setting the look ahead smoothness to 100% and enabling automatic view centering on release. And with that, we have completed the camera section, which takes us onto the last and definitely least, other. These settings are all pretty unimportant and also self-explanatory, and in my opinion, absolutely fine out of the box. The only things I change are enabling controller input and force feedback when window focus is lost, and sometimes disabling lossy compression for replays. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we are done. If this helped you in any way, please write a poem in the comments about how this video changed your life.